dear colleagues and guests, on behalf of Bazaar Forlag and the Science Library, I'm delighted to have you all here for the public lecture of Professor Yuval Harari. And before we listen to him, I'll give the word to Professor Jørn Hurum, who was the one who took the initiative to invite Harari here when he heard that that Bazaar Forlag was translating his book. So, welcome, firstly, Jørn Hurum.
Yeah, well, oh, sorry, that was really loud. Yeah, it's not, I try to read a lot of popular science books every year, and it's not often that I read a popular science book completely and like it. Mostly I end about halfway, but this was a book that was sent to me by the publisher, and I didn't know anything about it, but I started to read. And I read, and I read, and I read. And I think it's one of these really few popular science books that give you a different perspective on life. Yes, it's really big to say that, but for those of you that's not read it yet, I will not disclose too much because Harari will do that in his talk anyway. But really, the thoughts are so big, and the way he puts human history together in a package in one book, I've never read anything like it. So I really hope that you will appreciate the talk now and also read the book afterwards, because it's it made a lasting impression on my way of thinking, really. And hopefully that will also be part of the discussion after Harari's talk. So with no further ado, I'm not going to stand here and talk a lot. I'm a big fan. So I'm looking forward to your talk, Yuval. Welcome.
Thank you. So thanks for the introduction and the invitation, and for everybody who came to hear this talk about ourselves, about our species, about humankind, how we conquered the planet. If we go back around 70,000 years, then we find that our ancestors, Homo sapiens, that lived in East Africa back then, were insignificant animals. The most important thing you need to know about our ancestors is that they were unimportant animals. Their impact on the world, on the ecological system, was not much greater than that of chimpanzees or fireflies or jellyfish or woodpeckers or many other species of animals. If you look at the world today, you find that we dominate this planet. The future of life on Earth, to a large extent, depends on us. And the question I would like to address is how exactly we reached from there to here, from being insignificant apes minding their own business in a corner of Africa, not bothering anybody else too much, to being the masters of this planet and of the future of life. And when we raise this question of the secret of success of our species, people generally try to find the answer on the individual level, as if there is something special about the individual human being, about me, say, that makes me such a superior creature in comparison to a chimpanzee or to a dog or to a pig. But the truth is that on the individual level, I am embarrassingly similar to a chimpanzee. And if you place me and a chimpanzee together on some lonely island to see who survives better, I would definitely place my bets on the chimpanzee, not on myself. And I don't think it is something wrong with me personally. I guess if they took almost any one of you and placed you alone on some lonely island with a chimpanzee, the chimpanzee would probably do better. So it's not on the individual level that we need to look for the secret of success of our species. It's rather on the collective level. Humans, to make a long story short, we humans control the planet because we are the only animal, as far as we know, ever in the history of the planet that managed to cooperate flexibly in large numbers. Now, there are other animals, especially the social insects, like the ants and the bees and the termites, that know how to cooperate in very large numbers, but they don't have flexibility. Their system of cooperation is determined by their genetic code to such a degree that if, for example, a beehive faces a new danger or a new opportunity, there is no way that the bees are going to reinvent their social system overnight. There is no way that the bees can, for example, execute the queen bee and establish a communist dictatorship of worker bees. They can't do it. Other social animals, like the social mammals, like chimpanzees and baboons and dolphins and elephants, they are much more flexible in the way that they cooperate than the social insects, but they can cooperate only in relatively small numbers, because cooperation, for example, among our chimpanzee cousins, is based on intimate, personal acquaintance one with the other. If I'm a chimpanzee and you're a chimpanzee and I want to cooperate with you, I need to get to know you personally. What kind of chimpanzee are you? You're a nice chimpanzee? Are you an evil chimpanzee? Can I trust you? If I don't know you personally, I can't cooperate with you. And because it's impossible to get to know hundreds of thousands of individuals, then chimpanzees cannot cooperate in numbers larger than, say, about 100 or 200. Humans are the only animals that can combine the two abilities. We cooperate in very large numbers, much more so than the bees or the ants, yet we retain the flexibility of chimpanzees and wolves, and of course we are even much more flexible than they are. We can create social systems of cooperation that unite millions and today even billions of individuals and change them almost overnight. And this makes all the difference. 1 versus 1, or even 10 versus 10, we are not superior to chimpanzees. But if you pit 1,000 humans against 1,000 chimpanzees, the humans will easily win, for the simple reason that 1,000 chimpanzees cannot cooperate at all. And if you now try to cram 100,000 chimpanzees into a big sports stadium, or into, let's say, Wall Street, or the Vatican, you will get complete chaos. If you try to cram 100,000 humans into Wall Street or the Vatican or Wembley Stadium, you get very sophisticated networks of cooperation in religion or sports or economics. Even this lecture that I'm giving here can serve as a good example of this unique human ability. There are about, 150, 200 people now in this hall. I don't know the vast majority of you. I just came to Oslo for the first time 3 days ago flying from Tel Aviv. I don't know the pilot and the crew member of the plane of Austrian Airlines that brought me over here from Tel Aviv. I don't know the people who built this hall and who invented this computer and this screen that enables me, that helps me to convey my ideas to you. I don't know all the people who wrote all the books and articles that I've read in preparation for this talk. Even though all of these people are strangers, we don't know each other, nevertheless, we can cooperate effectively in order to create this global exchange of ideas. This is something that chimpanzees, again, cannot do. Chimpanzees certainly convey information to one another, but you never see a chimpanzee leaving his band and going to the territory of a distant chimpanzee band to give them a talk about bananas or about elephants or about humans or something else that might interest chimpanzees. It never happens. Of course, cooperation is not always nice. We usually associate cooperation like with Sesame Street, where we teach children to cooperate and be nice to each other, but should be emphasized that cooperation is also responsible for all the terrible things that humans have been doing throughout history, whether it's armies or slaughterhouses or prisons or concentration camps. All of these are also examples of unique ways of mass cooperation that only humans have. Chimpanzees don't have slaughterhouses and prisons and concentration camps. It's uniquely human ways of cooperating. And suppose that I perhaps managed to convince you that yes, our secret of success is this ability to cooperate in large numbers, in a flexible way, that all the big achievements of humankind, whether it's building the pyramids or reaching the moon or splitting the atom, these are all the result not of individual genius, they are the result of mass cooperation. The next question, which almost always pops up in the mind of an inquisitive audience, is what enables humans, alone of all the animals, to do it, to cooperate flexibly in large numbers. And the answer, at least the answer that I can give you, is the human imagination. And in particular, the ability to invent fictional stories and spread them around. If you examine any large-scale human cooperation, you will always find some fictional story at its basis. And this is a uniquely human ability. You can never convince a chimpanzee to give you a banana by promising him that if you give me this banana, after you die, you'll go to chimpanzee heaven, and there you will receive lots and lots of bananas for your good deeds here on earth, so now give me this banana. No chimpanzee will ever believe such a story. Only humans can believe such stories, which is why we control the world and not the chimpanzees. As long as millions of people all believe in the same story, they all follow the same laws, the same norms, they all believe in the same values, and this is what enables even complete strangers to cooperate effectively. Now, people usually find it perhaps easy to accept with regard to religion, especially when it's not their religion, and somebody else's religion. Yes, this is based on fiction, mine not, mine is the truth. But even if we leave religion aside, what I want to emphasize is that this mechanism of using fiction as the basis for cooperation is not a unique phenomenon to the religious field. It also forms the basis for human cooperation in all other fields, in politics, in the legal sphere, in the economic sphere. For example, in the legal and political sphere, perhaps the most important idea of our time is human rights. But human rights are a fiction, just like God and heaven. They are not a biological reality. If you take a human and cut him open and look inside, you find the blood and the kidneys and hormones and neurons. You don't find any rights. And even if you look very closely inside the DNA and you read what's written in the DNA, you don't find anywhere the Declaration of Human Rights written in genetic code. The only place you find rights is in the stories that people have invented, not very back in the distant past, but over the last few centuries, and spread around. And today, billions of people believe in this story that humans have a right to life and to liberty and to freedom of expression and so forth. And this forms the basis for much of the legal and political cooperation networks in the world. Now, I don't want to imply that this is bad. Fiction isn't bad. I mean, Harry Potter isn't bad. Fiction can be very good and it's a very powerful tool, but it's not reality. It's something that we construct in our imagination. And again, as long as everybody shares the same imagination, it works. The same thing happens in the economic sphere. Perhaps the greatest story ever told is the story of money. Not everybody believes in human rights. Not everybody believes in God. Not everybody believes in heaven and hell. But everybody believes in money. And even more amazingly, everybody believes in the same money. like the dollar bill. Now, the dollar bill, when you look at it, like human rights, it has no it's not an objective reality. It has this piece of paper has no objective value whatsoever. You cannot eat it, you cannot drink it, you cannot wear it, you can't do anything with it. But then come along the master storytellers of our era, not the people who won Nobel Prize in literature. They are not really good storytellers. The best storytellers in the world, they should really receive the Nobel Prize for literature. They are the chairman of the Federal Reserve. They are the big bankers, the finance ministers. They tell the best stories in the world. They come to us and they say, you see this green piece of paper? We are telling you that it is worth 10 bananas. And if I believe it and you believe it and everybody believes it, it actually works. I can take this worthless green piece of paper, go to the supermarket, give it to a complete stranger whom I've never met before, and he will give me real bananas in exchange, which I can actually eat. This is something that no other animal can do. Chimpanzees, they can trade, they can barter. I'll give you a coconut and you'll give me a banana. That can work among chimpanzees. But you'll give me a piece of paper and you expect to get bananas in return. This will not work with chimpanzees. You can try it. You can also try if you have a dog or a cat, try to give them money so they will give up your shoe or something. It won't happen. Only humans can believe such stories, which is why we have such sophisticated financial and trade relations, whereas all other animals do not. Now, what should be emphasized is that it's not easy to construct and to spread these stories. The difficulty is not in telling the story. The real difficulty is, of course, in convincing everybody to believe in the same story. If each person has a different story in the mind, it won't work. You need to implant the same stories in the minds of everybody, otherwise you can't form a system of cooperation. And much of history revolves around the question, how do you make millions of people believe in the same fictions? How do you make millions of people believe in the dollar bill and not in some other kind of currency, like the Bitcoin? How do you make millions of people believe in one God and not in a different God? This is a very difficult thing. Again, much of history revolves around this question. And of course, it doesn't always succeed. Many of the big conflicts in history are exactly about that. People sometimes think that humans fight for the same reason that other animals like chimpanzees fight. Chimpanzees fight over territory, chimpanzees fight over food, and people think this is for the similar reason that also humans fight. And there are maybe a few rare occasions when humans fight for territory or food, but this is very, very rare. The vast majority of wars and revolutions and conflicts in history were not about territory, they were not about food, they were about fictional stories in the mind of people. I come from Israel, so I know something about conflicts at first hand. And if you think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is about territory or food, you're mistaken. There is no objective shortage of land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. There is enough territory to build houses and schools and hospitals for everybody. There is no objective shortage of food. There is enough pita bread and falafel and hummus to feed everybody until they puke. I mean, there is no shortage of objective shortage of food. The real problem is that you have two groups with two very, very different stories in their mind, and they cannot agree on a single story that both can accept and identify with. To take a counterexample from European history, 100 years ago, Europeans were killing each other by the million in the First World War. And after it ended, they again killed each other by the million, even more, in the Second World War. In the second half of the 20th century, in the early 21st century, Europe became one of the most peaceful places ever in the history of humankind. What made the difference? Not the discovery of more land. It's not that suddenly new land emerged from the North Sea and they could divide it. You Germans take a bit, and you French take a bit, and now you'll be happy. No, there was no more new land. What happened is that Europeans managed to come up with a new story and a new identity, which most Europeans were able to accept and be relatively happy with. So this was the key to the very big change in the political history of Europe over the last century. We can say then, as kind of summarizing what we've covered so far, that humans are really unique animals and they dominate the planet because we live in a dual reality. All other animals live in an objective reality. The reality of chimpanzees consists of objective entities like rivers and trees and mountains and elephants and lions. These make up the world of a chimpanzee. We humans, we also, of course, live in an objective reality. In our world, too, there are rivers and trees and lions and elephants. But over the last tens of thousands of years, we have constructed on top of this objective reality a second layer of fictional reality, a reality consisting of fictional entities like nations, like churches, like gods, like business corporations. And over time, the amazing thing is that these fictional entities became more and more powerful, so that today they are the most powerful forces in the world. Today, the very survival of elephants and lions and chimpanzees and rivers and forests depends on the decisions and wishes of fictional entities like banks, like nations, like the European Union, like the United States. All these things exist only in our mind, in our imagination, in the stories that we tell, and nevertheless, they now determine the fate of more and more of the ecosystem. Now we see then that the human domination of the world is not really a matter of individual genius, and it's also not strictly a matter of technology. Yes, of course, humans dominate the world because they have all this amazing technology of trains and airplanes and computers and nuclear weapons and so forth. But technology by itself is never enough. You always need to combine technology with cooperation. You cannot invent and produce and use sophisticated technology unless you somehow manage to build systems of cooperation that unite thousands or millions or billions of human beings. And in order to establish such cooperation, you need a good story. You need an ideological story or a religious story that people would accept, would believe. In order to build, say, the Great Wall of China, of course, you needed some technology, maybe of metal tools and all kinds of things like that. But this by itself would never have been enough if the Chinese were not able to use fictional stories in order to unite millions of people into a single empire. Now, as we look at the development of history over the last 70,000 years, what we see is a complex relationship between technology on the one hand and religions, ideologies, and other kinds of stories on the other hand. Technology, of course, is often the basis for the new powers that humankind have acquired. But every step forward, every new technological revolution also upsets the systems, the old systems of cooperation. And unless people can find good stories to replace the obsolete old stories, the technology by itself only results in chaos, not in a real increase in the power of humankind, because you must find a way under the new technological conditions of still making millions of people to cooperate. A good example is the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. In the 19th century, humankind gained mastery over new technologies, new powers, like the steam engine, like electricity, like radio, like the internal combustion engine. But the immediate result of all these inventions was to create a lot of social and political chaos. The transition from traditional societies to modern industrial societies was extremely hard and difficult. New classes of people emerged, especially the urban proletariat, which people didn't know what to do with. And much of the political history of the 19th and 20th century revolved around the new problems of industrial society, which could not be solved, could not be answered using the traditional ideologies, religions, and stories of humankind. Of course, one of the first reactions, always, to such technological upheaval and such social upheaval is to try to go back to the old stories and to find some security. When there is change, most people, especially beyond a certain age, they don't like change. They're used to the world as it is, they don't like change. When there is a big change which destroys old institutions, old ways of life, and creates completely new religions, people first of all try to hold on to something stable, to find security. And therefore you often find that such revolutions are accompanied by a wave of fundamentalism. Fundamentalism means looking for a fundament, looking for a basis, and trying to go back to something that seems eternal, secure, that can protect us against all these changes. This happened in the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution. One of the first reactions to the Industrial Revolution was a wave of religious fundamentalism all over the world. I'll give just a few examples, there are many more. In Europe, for example, you had a wave of Catholic fundamentalism in the middle of the 19th century. The Pope, Pius IX, declared a new dogma of the Catholic Church, which said that not only all the answers to all the problems of humanity, including the new problems of industrial society, all the answers are of course in the Bible, but in addition to that, the Pope came up with a new dogma of papal infallibility, that the Pope is never wrong. Ask anything you want and you'll get the answer from the Pope. This is not a medieval dogma. Many people think that this dogma goes back to the Middle Ages or even to classical times. No, it's a 19th century dogma. Similarly, in the Middle East, you also have a wave of Muslim fundamentalism. For example, in Sudan, you have the movement of the Mahdi, a person who declares himself to be the Mahdi, the Messiah. Millions of people follow him. They defeat the Egyptian and English armies that are sent to try and suppress this rebellion. They behead the commander of the army, General Charles Gordon, in a gesture that shocks Victorian Britain in much the same way that the beheading now in the Middle East shock European audiences today. They establish a Muslim theocracy in the Sudan governed by Sharia law. And they say, yes, all the problem of modern society, of industrialism, of European imperialism, all the answers will come from the Quran and from the Sharia law. Similarly, in India, we have a Hindu revival movement which says that all the answers are in the Vedas, in the Hindu scriptures. It is led by this man, Dayananda Saraswati. In China, the biggest war of the 19th century, many people think that the biggest war of the 19th century was the Napoleonic War or perhaps the American Civil War, but actually the biggest war of the 19th century, and by a very wide margin, is the Taiping Rebellion in China, when this person, Hong Xiuquan, failed local scholar who couldn't even pass the examinations of the Chinese bureaucracy. After he fails the exams, he has a religious vision. God reveals himself to Hong and tells Hong that you, Hong, you are the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to earth by me, God, in order to establish the kingdom of heavenly peace. And Hong goes to the Chinese population in southern China with this message, and millions of people, which are extremely concerned and anxious because of the destabilizing of the Chinese economy and society, with the coming of European imperialism and with the coming of industrialization, they follow Hong because they hope that he has the answers. He doesn't establish a kingdom of heavenly peace. He leads them into the deadliest war of the 19th century. The Taiping Rebellion lasts about 14 years. According to the most modest estimates, at least 20 million people died in the Taiping Rebellion. And in the end, it was suppressed by the Chinese government, backed by the modern industrial powers of Europe. Now, I guess most of you have not heard about the Taiping Rebellion or about Dayananda Saraswati or about the Mahdi, because they all failed. They couldn't solve the new riddles, the new problems that were created by the Industrial Revolution. They looked for the answers in the wrong place. They looked for the answers in the Veda or in the Bible, in the Quran, but the people who wrote the Vedas and the Bible and the Quran didn't know anything about trains, about electricity, about modern industrial society and its unique problems and opportunities. So no wonder that no answers emerged from these places. In contrast, I guess most of you have heard about Marx and Engels and Lenin, even though in the early 19th century there were hardly any socialists at all. And even in 1850, in the middle of the 19th century, socialism was still a small fringe movement. Within a few decades, it became the most important and most influential ideological movement, or you can say even religious movement, of the 19th century. Why were they so successful? Because they didn't look for answers in ancient texts. Marx and Engels, and afterwards Lenin and Trotsky and all these fellows, they try to find new answers by studying the new technologies, by studying the new realities of industrial society. They studied how a railroad network impacts the economy. What are the conditions in modern factories? And based on that, they created new ideologies, new stories. Lenin was once asked, they asked him, please explain to us, Vladimir, what is communism? In one sentence. We don't want to read the Capital, it's too long, too complicated. In one sentence, what is communism? And Lenin answers, communism is power to workers' councils plus electrification of the whole country. There is no communism without electricity, without railroads, without radio. You could not establish a communist regime in 16th century Russia. You need modern industrial technology to have a communist regime. And communism, in a way, was the first techno-religion. A techno-religion is a story that promises people all the traditional prizes that also Judaism and Christianity and Hinduism promise. It promises peace and prosperity and paradise, but here on earth, with the help of technology, not after you die in some heavenly paradise with the help of supernatural being. Communism was the first techno-religion, again, making the old religious promises, but on the basis of modern technology. And even the people who did not follow Marx, it changed the way that they view the world. It changed the basic discourse until today of how we debate and how even we fight in the world. Until Marx and the Industrial Revolution, the big ideological conflicts in human history were often about metaphysical questions concerning the soul and God and the afterlife. Christians and Muslims, or Protestants and Catholics, they were arguing what will happen to the soul after we die. How do you reach heaven? How do you prevent yourself from ending in hell? These were the big divides between, say, the Catholics and the Protestants. Ever since Marx and the communists and the Marxists, the big divides, the big ideological divides of humankind are no longer about the soul, or about the afterlife, or about God. They are about technology, about the economy, about production methods. In the 1960s and 1970s, say during the Cuban Missile Crisis, humankind almost destroyed itself and much of the ecological system in an argument about production methods, not in an argument about the soul and God and the afterlife. Now, all this is very relevant to what's happening today in the world because we are on the verge or in the beginning of a new industrial revolution. If in the 19th century humankind gained mastery over the power of steam and oil and electricity, then in the 21st century we are gaining mastery over the new powers released by biotechnology and computer science. And this revolution will probably be far more influential, far more radical than anything that we saw in the 19th and 20th century. Back then, in the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, the new powers of steam and electricity and so forth, we humans used them in order to produce food and textiles and vehicles and weapons. Now in the 21st century, the main products of the new revolution will not be textiles and vehicles and food. They will be bodies and brains and minds. These are the main products of the 21st century human economy. We are learning how to manufacture, how to design and to produce bodies and brains and minds of ourselves and of other organisms and even of non-organic entities. After 4 billion years, during which life was confined to the relatively small realm of organic compounds, now life is about to break out into the vastly larger empire of inorganic stuff. And after 4 billion years in which all creatures, whether dinosaurs or amoebas, were made solely of organic compounds, in the next few decades we are likely to see the emergence of non-organic life. And the greatest revolution not only in history but also in biology. And all of this will, of course, create huge disturbances in human social systems, in human political systems, in the story that we tell ourselves in order to manage billions of people on a single planet. It will present us with enormous new opportunities as well as with unprecedented dangers and threats. On the one hand, we'll have the possibility of upgrading humans into superhumans. If we are giving up on gods, but we will turn ourselves into new kinds of gods, we'll maybe acquire divine abilities through ourselves. At the same time, the same technology threatens to create new unprecedented gaps between different human classes or castes. Previously in history, all class division was legal, economic, and political, but it was never biological. There was never any real deep difference on a biological level between the kings and the peasants, between the upper caste and the lower caste. In the future, however, in the not too distant future, we may for the first time see humankind splitting into different biological castes, with real differences in physical and cognitive abilities between the rich and the poor, or between the elite and the masses of the population. At the same time, we may see, for example, the emergence of new classes of people, just as the 19th century created a new massive class of the urban proletariat, and much of subsequent political history revolved around the question what to do with this new class of the urban proletariat. Similarly, in the 21st century, we may see the emergence of a new massive class of useless people. People who have absolutely no economic value. It's estimated that within, say, 30 years or so, up to 50% of the jobs in the job market will be taken over by artificial intelligence and computers. Everything from driving taxis to diagnosing diseases to even teaching artificial intelligence will be able to do better than humans, there will be, of course, new jobs created, which we don't know of today, but even the new jobs might be performed far better by artificial intelligence than by humans. So we are looking at the possibility of a new massive class of useless humans and of immense, whereas the 20th century was a century of closing gaps, of growing equality in the world, the 21st century may be the most unequal century in human history in terms of social inequality. Not surprisingly, then, we also see now a new wave of fundamentalism in different places around the world, not only in the Middle East, and it's the same basic reaction. When you threaten the stability of the world, many people, especially people who are about to lose from the new situation, try to hold on to something stable and secure, and the first instinct is to go back to some story which seems to be eternal, which seems to be immutable, immune to all these dangers, to all these changes. But as happened in the 19th century, also in the 21st century, it's very unlikely that the answers to questions, to the new questions, will come from this fundamentalist wave. If we are asking ourselves how to face the threats and opportunities of things like genetic engineering or artificial intelligence, we are not likely to get the answers from the Bible or from the Vedas, because the people who wrote the Bible and the Vedas and the Quran and so forth didn't know anything about genetics and didn't know anything about computers. So it's not surprising that the answers are not there. Instead, we'll probably see the emergence of completely new ideologies, completely new religions, completely new stories. Not even socialism and liberalism have the relevant answers. They are ideologies adapted, fit to the conditions of industrial society, of 19th and 20th century industrial society. They don't have the answers to the new problems of the 21st century. Where will the new religions emerge from? Probably not from the Middle East. If you are looking for the new Muhammad or for the new Lenin, he or she is probably in Silicon Valley and not in the Middle East. This is where the new techno-religions are emerging from. Just as communism promised paradise on earth with the help of electricity and steam power, so now you see the emergence of new religions, new techno-religions that promise paradise on earth with the help of genetic engineering and artificial intelligence and computer algorithms and so forth. And they are much more ambitious than anything we've previously seen throughout human history. To give just one example before I wrap it up and leave time for the discussion. For the first time, I mean, even Lenin and Marx, with all their ambitions, never went as far as promising people immortality. Yes, paradise on earth, but eventually, even in the socialist paradise, you die. And they kept their mouth shut about what's happening to you after you die. But the new techno-religions that we see emerging from Silicon Valley and similar places across the world, they even promise immortality here on Earth with the help of technology. For example, Google has established 2 or 3 years ago a sub-company called Calico, whose stated mission is to solve the problem of death. Just as we solved all these other technical problems, we are going also to solve this nasty problem of death. Throughout history, people assumed that death was some kind of metaphysical phenomenon, that we die because the gods or the single great creator God decreed that we must die, and there is nothing we can do to change that. Maybe when Jesus comes back to earth, or when the Messiah comes, then we can overcome death, but not before then. Now, more and more scientists are having second thoughts about this defeatist approach. They say we don't need to wait for Jesus Christ to come back to earth in order to overcome death. a couple of geeks in a laboratory can do it. If you just give them enough money and enough time, they can do it. Death is not a metaphysical phenomenon. Death is simply a technical problem. Why do people die? They don't die because the angel of death suddenly appears and taps them on the shoulder and tells them, come with me, like in an Ingmar Bergman movie. No, people always die because of some technical problem, like the heart stops pumping blood, or cancer is spreading in your liver or something like that. And science says that every technical problem has a technical solution. Maybe we don't know the solution yet, but given enough time and money and energy, we can find this solution. True or false, I won't go into this here, but certainly the new stories, that the most amazing and fascinating stories which might serve as the basis for a new systems of cooperation in the 21st century world, we are beginning to see them emerging from places like Silicon Valley. I would end then on this tension, on the note of this tension between technology and storytelling, and emphasizing that good technology is never enough. Humans don't dominate the planet because they know how to produce very sophisticated technology. If they don't match this technology with good stories, the result is chaos. The result can be complete destruction. Technology is neutral. It can, technology is never really neutral. It changes the world, but whether it changes it for good or evil really depends on the stories that people believe and the stories that people use in order to organize themselves. I think we can say without any doubt that in the 21st century, we will see amazing new technology, better than anything, much more powerful than anything we've seen previously in history. The really big and interesting question is whether we'll be able to produce good stories to match this wonderful technology. If not, it's going to be very bad news, not only to human beings, but probably to almost all other organisms on the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And then I would like to give the word to Linn Stalsberg, who will conduct the talk afterwards. So you sit here in the bright yellow chair.
Okay.
Thank you. Is this working? Yes. Thank you, Professor Harari, for this interesting sweeping through our fictional and less fictional reality, past and present. I was a student here as well in this room studying history for something that feels like 1,000 years ago, before the mobile phone, before the internet, before Google and Facebook, and certainly before any professor in history talked about superhumans and artificial intelligence. So you certainly bring something new to our age and to this room and to the profession. On the floor is Jan Grue, author, linguist, professor in special needs education here at the university. You also wrote a review of Harari's book in Klassekampen. Then we have Lene Liebe Delseth, biologist, doing her PhD in paleontology. She's also a concerned scientist, I reckon, talking about environment, and she blogs about her work for anyone who wants to read. So welcome, all of you. And Professor Grue, this is your new title. Your immediate reactions to the talk and any question?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for the talk. That was a lot to take in, so I'll have to try and pick my question carefully. I can't help thinking about the 100,000 chimps loose on Wall Street. I think that may be exactly what happened a few years ago. But I mean, I was very interested in your both in reading your book and then hearing your lecture about your notion of powerful fictions, fictions that help us coordinate social action and help us do a number of things. And at the very end of your talk, I started wondering about Google, because in one story, they're a technological company, which is, as you say, they're powering the emergence of incredibly sophisticated new technologies in some areas. And in another story, they're an advertising company making 90-something% of their enormous revenue from instructing us in how to buy things from other humans. So which story is the right one in that case?
I think they believe in a third story, even more powerful, that they're basically going to save humankind.
Yeah.
That they are the new leaders or the new gurus, that what governments are not doing, which is thinking seriously about the future of humankind, then it's left to the free market. And many people, especially in Silicon Valley, are convinced that only they have the ability, the information, and the goodness to think about this and to guide us towards the future. And I'm not saying necessarily that this is wrong, and I actually think that it's good that somebody is thinking about the future, because governments apparently are not doing it. But certainly it's very, very troubling that at least their current economic model is based on advertisement. I think that this is a very worrying situation when so much power is concentrated in the hands of a corporation, most of whose revenues comes from convincing us to buy things we don't really need necessarily.
Delseth. Here we have a professor in history, and you're a biologist, and he's kind of entering your field of study, claiming it very confidently as well. What is your reaction to what you heard today?
I really, really like the book, and I found it very interesting that you're actually, in a real way, combining history and biology and trying to see these two things together and to tell a story that is it properly linked, these two fields. So I've been actually very curious about how you did this, and because I think it's very inspiring that it's possible to combine the natural science and humanities in this way. So I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how did you do it? How difficult is it? Because sometimes you think that this is a very big divide between these things, but I think your book is proving otherwise.
I think the basic realization is that humans are animals, and we share so much of our instincts, of our emotions, of our desires with other animals, especially other social mammals, that you cannot really understand history and you cannot really understand human society unless you take it to heart that we are part of the animal kingdom. We are not something set apart. Now, of course, you have to resist the temptation to go all the way and to say, okay, so we just need biology and we don't need philosophy and art history and history. If somebody knows biology, he can explain everything, or she can explain everything. This is, of course, not true. There are still differences between us and other animals. Simply knowing our evolutionary history, simply knowing our genetic code and the way that the body functions, wouldn't explain historical phenomena like the rise of Christianity or like the Second World War. There are no strictly biological explanations to such phenomena. So you have to find a middle way. The way that the curriculum in academic institutions is today makes it very, very difficult. As you say, You're all the time pressured to specialize in narrower and narrower fields. Not only biology and history, but even if you specialize in history, so nobody really specializes in history. I for example, specialize in medieval military history. This was my initial field of study and research, things like the Crusades and the 100 Years' War. And you're constantly encouraged not to stray out of very limited boundaries, because nobody is going to write a PhD on the history of the world, and it's extremely difficult to publish articles on wide subjects. The academic world is still governed by the laws of publish or perish, and if you want to publish, then you usually have to focus on, at least at first, on a very, very narrow subject, and then it's a vicious circle, because you get your scholarship or you get your position in university because you're an expert in medieval military history. So they expect you to give classes on medieval military history and to train students in that. And then you are caught in the circle, and suddenly breaking out and starting to read or be interested in biology is very difficult. I don't have an institutionalized answer. On my part, when I got my, how do you say in English, tenure at the university, then I was free of the publish or perish cycle. They couldn't fire me anymore. So even if I don't publish, I won't perish. And this was the moment that I said to myself, okay, now I can do whatever I want. And luckily it succeeded, but there was no guarantee that it would succeed. So I would advise people to be very wary. I mean, until you get tenure, you are subject to the publish or perish law. And if you start trying to combine biology and history and so forth, you're very likely to perish.
Yeah, I got tenure 3 weeks ago, so I'll remember
congratulations.
that. Good to know. I was curious about the sort of following up on the last question, because you've definitely written a big book with 2 capital B's. And it seems to me like most of the big books being written these days, if they are interdisciplinary, are written by humanists who go to the sciences rather than the other way around. Do you have any thoughts about why that might be the case?
Because as a humanist, I can nevertheless say that the most interesting developments nowadays are happening in the natural sciences, especially in information science and in brain science and biology in general. This is where the most interesting developments are happening. And you can actually even say that for the first time, maybe in the history of science, you see a single paradigm taking over the entire scientific world. It's the paradigm of data processing. Now everything is understood in terms of algorithms and data processing. It started in 2 main disciplines, which is computer science, but also biology. You can summarize maybe 150 years of biology since Darwin in 3 words, which are organisms, are algorithms. This is the basic realization, I think, of the biological sciences in the last century. And you combine this with the powerful tools that now computer science is giving us, and you get a winning combination that is taking over the entire scientific world. So you have now even economists understanding the economy as in terms of data processing and algorithm. The market is simply a system for processing data. And you're now seeing also historians and linguists understanding their subject in similar terms. So it's kind of a wave which begins in these disciplines, but is now infiltrating and even taking by storms even the humanities.
Thank you. Could I just briefly follow up on that? Because it makes me wonder, and I think you are quite right in describing these immensely important forces within the sciences, and that makes me wonder what the role of a traditionally trained humanities person such as yourself will be in interacting with these massively influential disciplines. Because the humanities have traditionally been about, as opposed to numbers, have been about language, thinking through language and developing a critique through language. So what space is available for that kind of role today?
I think there is still a very important place for them, and this is what I'm trying to do in my research and in my books, because as I try to emphasize also in my talk, you cannot really understand humans without taking into account the biological infrastructure. But if you miss the cultural, the fictional bit, you cannot really understand anything. And if you take another example, if you think about German history in the 20th century, so you find the same people with the same DNA, with the same geography, with the same climate, that have 5 completely different regimes over a very short time, a single century. You have the Second Reich, and then you have the Weimar Republic, then you have the Nazi regime, then you have communist East Germany, then you have reunited democratic liberal Germany. The same people, same DNA, same climate, same geography, same everything. If you just think in terms of the natural sciences, this is an inexplicable riddle. How can it be? You need the humanities with their understanding of language, of stories, of culture, of fiction, to explain such a phenomenon. So, but I think the crucial thing is for people from the humanities not to be afraid. I mean, most people in the humanities are especially afraid of numbers and equations. Like you open a book, you see an equation, you immediately close it and put it back on the shelf. And I don't like equations either, I don't really like numbers either, but I realize that in the 21st century, if the humanities are going to remain relevant, they will have to understand, at least to some extent, things like genetics and things like information theory. And for this, they will have to go out of their comfort zone.
Considering you're a historian, we have been talking a lot about the future, you have been talking a lot about the future. And in your future, there are cyborgs or transhumanism or some kind of connection between biology and computers. Now I would like to ask Delset, since you are concerned about environment, climate change, that kind of issues, how do you compare that struggle or that concern with his technological view of the future?
Yeah, it's kind of scary to read about the future in your book, and yeah, it's kind of scary, and it's very interesting too, because there are a lot of things that I don't know anything about before reading it. But on a broader level, I find it a bit strange that you choose, when you talk about the future, you talk mostly about cyborgs and biotechnology, and as you said in your talk, this is obviously something for a very small elite. Mm-hmm. And you also say in your book that concerning natural resources and energy, history has shown us that humans always find a new way to make energy. Mm-hmm. But I think the most defining thing for humanity the next centuries is actually not biotechnology or finding energy for a small elite, but climate change and the fact that we're actually using the resources in a way that actually empties the resources in the world. So I was wondering if you could say a bit about that.
Yes, I think that there is a big difference between resource scarcity and climate change. Resource scarcity, I don't think, is likely to be a major problem, because in this field, it's likely that we will keep finding. I mean, for the last 200 years, humans have been using more and more resources like oil and gas and iron and steel and whatever, and all the time we only have more resources than before, because we keep discovering new sources of energy, new sources of raw materials, and so forth. Climate change and biological and ecological degradation is a very different thing. This is the really big danger. We probably are approaching a future in which we have an abundance of resources, but a ruined planet and a ruined ecosystem. And you said that these concerns of cyborgs and so forth, this is only of a small elite, and this is completely true. But what happens usually in history is that you have a small elite that pushes things in its own interests, even if it doesn't benefit the vast majority of the population. This has happened so many times previously in history, and it's probably going to happen again. One of the biggest dangers to the planet today is this technological utopia, because probably for the elite it will work. If bad comes to worse, then when the flood comes, the scientists will build a Noah's Ark for the elite, leaving the rest to drown, the rest of the people and the rest of the ecosystem. But they are likely to be able to construct this technological Noah's Ark, which is probably what much of the elite is counting on. And this is extremely dangerous. But to take a slightly different angle, coming back to stories, the most powerful story today in the world, which everybody believes, the Chinese, the Americans, the Israelis, the Iranians, everybody believes in the story of economic growth, which says that economic growth is the essential factor without which we cannot solve any of our social or political problems. And no government today on earth can survive willingly stopping economic growth. At the same time, you cannot, with present-day technology, there is no way you can save the ecological system unless you stop human economic growth. The only time, despite all these conferences in Paris and Copenhagen and so forth, the graph of greenhouse gas emissions just goes up and up. The only time in the last 20 years that the graph went down was in 2008, 2009, because of the economic crisis. And the political realities of the world today is that for any government to stop economic growth, it doesn't matter if it's democratic or authoritarian, is suicide. And also, it's not only the elite, it's the masses of the voters. I mean, if you think about, I don't know, the Chinese or the Indians, if you give Chinese and millions of Chinese and Indians the same standard of living as the average American or Norwegian, this is the end of the ecological system as we know it. The system will collapse. But they are saying rightly, why should we go on living as we do when the Americans and the Europeans are living in their paradise? We are not willing for that. And at present, we don't see a way out of this deadlock.
So you couldn't see a future where people go more back to simple living or ecological farmers, things like this? You see it's inevitable that we go into a technological connection?
The problem is that, again, it goes back to the stories in which people believe and goes back to Google and their advertisement that consumerism is now rampant across the world. And this is why the basic, what consumerism and capitalism say basically, that if you want a better life, whether as individuals or as a society, you need to buy more stuff. And in order to buy more stuff, you need to produce more stuff. That's a very simple story. As long as people believe in that, you cannot really stop the destruction of the planet. Now, giving up this story and saying, no, I can be happy with less, I can be happy without buying more stuff, it will be a very difficult job convincing billions of people around the world, especially when you have Google and all these other corporations whose entire model is built on convincing people just the opposite, that they must have more stuff in order to have a better life.
But who can create a new story? Who can be the new storytellers? Couldn't that be you?
It's extremely difficult. I mean, as I said, the difficulty is not in inventing the story. Everybody can invent a story. But how to convince billions of people to believe in your story, especially given the odds, it doesn't seem that humankind is about to change the story in which it believes. Probably only a crisis or a catastrophe could trigger a real change in human thinking. We can only hope that it would not be late. It would not be too late by then.
Do you agree with this?
Well, I think there is a, let me put it this way, there's an interesting tension in your book between the power of stories on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the sense that technology and to some extent economic forces are more or less deterministic. So it makes me uncertain about how you feel about the genuine power of stories, because if they can't really be changed, then why should we care about them?
Well, they can be changed. It's just very, very difficult because there is no simple relationship between the economic and material sphere and the sphere of stories and imagination and fiction. I mean, Marxists, for example, have a very simplistic view that the economy, the material basis, comes first, and everything else, all the stories, all the ideologies, they are just a superstructure determined by the economic basis. And then you have idealists who think the other way around, that no, the stories, the culture is the basis, and the economy is just a byproduct. And most likely, you have kind of a circular relationship between the two. Each is influencing the other, and you cannot say this is more important or this is more basic. The kind of stories you can tell and convince people to believe cannot be divorced from the technological realities and the economic realities of the day. On the other hand, technology is never deterministic. With exactly the same technology, you can construct completely different societies. With the technology of the Industrial Revolution, you could construct a communist society, you could construct a capitalist society, you could construct a fascist society. The technology itself, the trains, the radio sets, the cars, did not tell you what to do with them. This was the job of the storytellers. On the other hand, the storytellers could not just tell any story they wanted. If you, in 1900, you began to tell a story of some hunter-gatherer tribe, say from 20,000 years ago, it was simply irrelevant to the realities of the people. So you have this tension, this complex relationship all the time, and the technology and the stories, they cannot they cannot stray away from one another too much.
Well, what is not fiction but fact is that we only have like a couple of minutes left of this talk before we all walk the green carpet to the book signing. So I will give you all the last words of this session. I'll start with you, and then the main person.
Yeah, first of all, I would very much like to thank you for an amazing book again, and a very interesting talk. And I also want to ask for a challenge, because I was presented first as a biologist, but I'm the type of biologist that care mostly about our past. I work with fossils that are 150 million years old, so I'm kind of like a historian in biology. And in the book, you give a lot of, I think, inspiration to historians on what they should work more on. And it's quite obvious what the biologists working on biotechnology will be spending their days on. But what would be your challenge for people like me, people who work with understanding the past of the Earth?
I think there are two challenges. First of all, to try in your research also to find or to work with the more immaterial aspects of animals, of the animals or even plants whose fossils you work with, and try to find the deep history of ideas, of emotions, of social relations, usually the most difficult things to see in a fossil. And on the other hand, which is true of all realms of science, to see what is the impact of your findings on the society and politics of today. That the job of the scientist is not simply, okay, I have this technical field, I discover what I discover, I publish a paper and my job is done. But to go like the extra mile and see what are the implications or potential implications of my work for the way people view the world, for the ideologies, for the religions, for the stories that shape our life.
Lots of questions I could have posed, but for the humanities person working today, I mean, for scientists, it's possible to publish narrowly and still be part of big, relevant projects. How is it possible to be a successful humanities or social sciences person without writing a book like yours?
Well, it depends what you mean by successful. If it means like getting a job at university and then getting tenure and so forth, so focusing on a very narrow subject is probably the best advice I can give. It's not the most satisfying, it's not the most responsible thing that a humanities expert can do, but it's certainly the safest thing in terms of, if you understand success in these terms. But I think, as I try to convey it in my lecture, that especially today, with all the immense interest which is generated by the new technologies, especially in biotechnology and computer science, and people have the feeling that the humanities have nothing to contribute to it. So what I try to emphasize is that especially today there is an extremely important role for the humanities, because again, technology itself doesn't tell us what to do with it. And people who specialize, say in biotechnology or in computer science, they are very good in producing new algorithms or producing new drugs or new medical treatments. But they don't necessarily have the background to understand the social, the political, and the philosophical implications of what they are doing. And this, I think, is the responsibility of the people in the humanities. And so far, I'm afraid they don't really rise up to the challenge, at least not enough. There is, I don't know how it is in Norway, but in Israel there is a constant complaint about the crisis of the humanities and the fact that they are becoming irrelevant and that people are not interested in them. And I think it's, to a large extent, the fault of the humanities themselves, that they need to connect to the present day issues. And for that, they also need to connect to what's happening in the natural sciences, in the biological sciences. And then they will find that they are extremely relevant to the main discussions of the day, and that there is no crisis, there is no reason why there should be a crisis in the humanities. And the things that we really need today in the world is not so much more computer programs or more drugs, but we need new stories. And these are unlikely to emerge from the computer science department.
Thank you very much, Professor Harari. And I must say that you have shown us that being an academic can be much more than trying to impress the professor next door. And as a journalist in science, I experienced that quite a lot. And I think you leave everyone with a big challenge of creating new stories. Personally, I told my two boys they're not allowed to move out of home until they read your book. Because it's, whether you agree or disagree with your ideas and thoughts, it's challenging, and it's everything you don't learn in school. So thank you very much, and we'll all walk the green carpet to the next building for book signing and mingling and chatting and storytelling, perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Varsågod.